marijuana.
Somebody in the crowd that's bad, so we cannot take it out on everybody, you get what I'm saying?
Hi.
Welcome to our panel this evening. We have a lot of people that are viewing online, so hello everyone that is watching from all over, really. We've gotten some emails and some messages online saying that you guys are tuned in from all over the US, so that's really exciting. Welcome, and we're so thankful to have you guys at this panel. My name is Savannah. I'm the pastor of college and young adults here at Capitol, and I oversee our ministry, Please Elaborate, where we do indeed elaborate on some really challenging conversations so that we can be better people, be better communities, and be a better church. And so that is exactly what we're going to do today. And I want to welcome you all to our second panel of the year, Please Elaborate on the Black Experience in America. So I'm very excited for everyone that is here. We have some incredible people on this panel. I'm going to let them introduce themselves very, very shortly. But before we begin, I want to encourage us all to step into a spirit of learning and open-mindedness. May we be a community that receives the stories and the pains of our Black brothers and sisters and leave our defensiveness at the door. Whether you are new to these discussions on racial injustice or you have these conversations all the time, these conversations will be difficult. They will not be easy. But let's rise to the occasion and remember that while for some of some of us here, these are stories. For others, these are depictions of life, real life. Let's be willing to be uncomfortable in our effort to seek healing. These incredible people sitting on this panel today each bring unique stories and experiences to this conversation. They are pivotal leaders in their communities, and they are prolific communicators in their fields. And so, without further ado, I'm gonna let our panelists introduce themselves. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Samantha. I am a marketing and program coordinator, and I am also a student at Sacramento State.
I'm Naomi, and I am a staff accountant here at Capitol.
Hello, my name is Dr. Stacy Walton. I'm a pediatrician and cultural anthropologist. Currently, I'm working with a small startup called Take Your Seat as the DEI strategist. And we are, our mission is to put more Black professionals in executive leadership positions, especially board seats.
Hello, my name is Ruth. I am also a student at Sac State, and I am a student employee at Sac State's Academic Advising Center.
Hello, everyone. My name is Trey Sales. I work for Jacobs. It's an engineering solutions provider, and I run our graduate development program in our talent development section. And I just want to add, I love that you send emails still. I like when you talk about big groups. That's just a beautiful thing that I'm acknowledging you said. Sorry.
Are you calling me archaic?
No, it's actually amazing because it's very helpful for me. That was a side note. I'm sorry. But yeah.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Samuel Gordon, and I am the Diversity Culture Pastor here at Capitol Christian Center.
Thank you. Let's give it up for our panelists before we begin. Give a round of applause. Yeah, it's really exciting. Pivotal leaders here, like I said. Before we jump in, I just want to give a little bit of context. Before we discuss a lot of different topics on this panel, I want to give some context so that we can all come to these conversations with a common denominator of information, so that we're coming at this with some semblance of commonality in terms of context in the Black experience. When we think of racism, we might often think of the year 1619, when two ships called the White Lion and the Treasurer arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, with slaves acquired from Angola, Africa. And while this is technically true, we depart from authentic history when we assume that racism is just that, historical. Because the events of that year have ricocheted throughout American history. Racism did not die with slavery, it simply changed forms. From the Three-Fifths Compromise to segregation to Jim Crow laws. From 1882 to 1968, there were over 4,700 lynchings here in America that we know of. Most went undocumented. And 75% of those lynchings were of Black Americans. A lynching is the extrajudicial public killing of a person with or without legal trial. Some of the Black Americans lynched at the hands of white people include Emmett Till, James Chaney, Mary Turner, Jesse Washington, Mac Charles Parker, Clinton Melton, Martin Luther King, Willie Turks, James Beard, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. Today, white people make up a little over 57% of the US population. So it makes sense that white people also make up 57% of the prison population. That's factually, statistically accurate. Black people make up 13% of the American population, but make up 38% of the prison population. Why is that? Was it the war on drugs propaganda in the 70s, criminalizing and demonizing Black people and placing Black men in prison for crimes white men walked away from? Is it the fact that Black women make 48 to 68 cents on the dollar paid to white men? Or the fact that generational wealth and the passing down of property was made nearly impossible for Black Americans in the 60s and 70s due to redlining and banks refusing to give loans to Black families? Or is it the fact that Black women have the highest rate of death in childbirth in America due to racism in the healthcare system? The fact that predominantly Black communities in school receive some of the lowest amounts of government funding? Similarly to looking at the prison system, looking at any one of these issues can lead us down a rabbit hole of other issues of racial injustice. And that is the result of centuries of legislation and societal norms being built alongside and sometimes in collaboration with racist ideologies. Most people in this room and watching online, myself included, would not consider ourselves racist. But are we educating ourselves on the history of racism and where it's present today? Do we know the stories of hate crimes and microaggressions experienced by our Black friends? There is a difference between not hating your neighbor and loving your neighbor, and the difference is action. Are we actively educating and fighting against racism in America? And this panel won't solve all of these issues, but we do hope that through the conversations that you are about to hear, you will be equipped with the knowledge and history, but also the empathy and the understanding necessary to ensure that our future is better than our past. And with that, we're going to begin with our first question, which is to Ruth, my dear friend, lovely Ruth. Having grown up in Africa, what was the biggest shock to moving to America? And what does it mean to be Black in Africa versus what it means to be Black in America?
Yeah, so I guess I can start off saying that I was born and raised in Ethiopia. I moved here when I was around 13. And it's been a while. I mean, 8 years does not seem very long, but it feels long to me. And I guess the biggest shock I felt moving here was coming from being the majority to being the minority. You're usually constantly seeing people that look like you in like school, your peers look like you, your staff and faculty look like you, and then you move here, and then there's barely anybody that looks like you. I'll say that maybe in 8th grade I had maybe 1 or 2 Black faculty, so it was really shocking to just come from a background of seeing people that look like you and then not. And I guess another shocking part would be the fact that I wasn't really exposed to racism growing up, so coming here and learning that racism existed was really difficult to comprehend and never made sense at first, especially because it's like, why would you treat others differently because of their race? And it was something that I had to process and sit down and actually think about, which is surprising to a lot of people because you would expect, since you're Black, you would kind of know this, but no, moving here, this was my first experience listening and hearing about racism because it was something that I did not have to think about growing up in Africa. And I would say the biggest difference is that when you grow up in Africa, being Black is not something you constantly have to put into regard. While you're here, that is something that you have to always consider and think about because, I mean, it's not a lie that the system is somewhat built to hinder you from getting to where you are. Even like thinking about the people I was looking like up to growing up, they were almost all Black, and you come here and people in higher education and everything is super different. So I would say, yeah, that was the biggest shock and the biggest difference between moving here and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Naomi, can you walk us through what a microaggression is? We hear that word a lot, and a lot of people might not know what that means.
Yeah, so a microaggression is an action or a behavior or even a comment that targets a marginalized group. A lot of times it's unintentional. It's just something that comes from an internal bias that you have. And so it can come out in the form of, oh, you're so articulate. You speak so well. When you grew up in America, you have learned English your whole life. That's your first language, but someone says that to you, or your people must be so proud when you're like a doctor or something, and it's like, yeah, they are, my family is, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. So it's a lot of things like that, even behavior-wise. It can be someone following you in a store, as if you weren't able to pay for something yourself, or if you're gonna steal or something like that. So it's definitely something that's more subtle, and it's not a full-on aggression, like saying a racist slur or saying go back to your country or something like that. It's something that's more nuanced, and it happens on like a day-to-day basis, and a lot of people don't even realize that they're doing something like that. And so I actually have a few forms of microaggressions. There's verbal, which is like you talk so well, kind of, you're so articulate. Behavioral, and then environmental is discrimination within society. So if you go to a college campus, you might see all these buildings named after white individuals, Washingtons, and all these things, but no prominent black figures are named in the school or taught in the curriculum a lot of times. So, yeah, that's kind of what a microaggression is.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to add to that? I know that that is a hefty term to unpack. Tough to put into 3 minutes. Stacy?
I would love to add to that.
I know you would.
I actually use a different term, or I'm going blank. I use a different term instead of microaggression because I think it doesn't really describe the level of harm that someone experiences when they experience a microaggression. And this is not my term. It's subtle acts of exclusion. The idea that the microaggressions can be incredibly subtle, like you were saying, and oftentimes they're very unintentional. No one is really out to harm you. But what happens is, especially with the African American experience, is we experience these subtle acts of exclusion all day long. And they build up, and it is very, very traumatizing. And we know, I'm a healthcare provider, we know that trauma affects your body, affects your hormones, affects your nervous system, and causes medical harm. So oftentimes I've heard people say, well, it's not that big a deal. Well, if it happens once, maybe not, but if it happens 5, 10, 15 times a day, 365 days a year, and I'm not going to share how old I am, it can be quite debilitating. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Pastor Samuel, I have a big-hitting, hard-hitting question for you. What do you wish Christians, specifically white Christians, knew about the Black experience in America? And where do you think the church has failed the Black community?
That is a loaded question. It's a deep question, but it's an appropriate question because we live in a time and a culture where we need to have more conversations like this. And I want to thank you and your team for creating this space where we can have these kinds of frank and real conversations outside of what we do on a Sunday. We need to have more of these kind of town hall meetings, so to speak, where we talk about what's going on in your life, where you live, your community. So when we talk about the Black experience and what the church, my white brothers and sisters need to know about the Black experience, I look at my own life, and I am 4 generations removed from slavery. So my generation, we have lived a life where we have always, every day, we have to figure out, why is there a problem with me only because of the color of my skin? Why is there a problem? Why am I treated differently? Why in school am I treated differently? Why in school are they saying, well, you're never going to be a doctor or a lawyer, maybe a janitor or a bus driver? It was always a put down. And so for generations, Blacks have always had to answer that question, why am I second class just because of the color of my skin? And then you try to figure out how not to hate yourself while navigating through a society that hates you. When you have young kids growing up, figuring out that your hair is not right, or you're too dark, or you tell little kids, our Black kids, that they want white dolls and everything because they associate that with success, being white, being different than where you are. So they create this, I hate myself, I hate the way I look. And so that's a trauma that our young Black and brown kids have to face all of the time. We have a long history of pain. We have a long history of rejection and mistrust. And we have a long history of being stereotyped. And so you ask the question, why are black and brown people skeptical and fearful? They've been traumatized, and they're on the brink of being physically depleted. And they may not show any signs of it, but it's hard to sleep at night. And you got to drink some tea to calm your nerves, and melatonin to try to help you get through the night. The trauma and the stress. I call it spiritual PTSD because of the culture that we live in. And so that's a challenge for black and brown people that they have had to walk through for all their lives. And I'm so excited to be a part of this panel with this generation to saying, God has better for me. I'm coming out of this. I want to be the best version of myself. God has a plan and a purpose and a path for my life, and I want to find out what that is and embrace it. So this is where it starts. If I were to say to my brothers and sisters in Christ, my white brothers and sisters in Christ, we've got a lot of work to do. No longer can you sit on the sideline and just watch the parade go by, or watch someone else fix the problem, or say that that's political and I don't want to get involved in it. But you need to understand that if you're going to partner with me and walk with me, then I need you to understand my past and understand what I'm feeling right now, and partner with me to create a better future for the next generation and for our children and our grandchildren. So we have to get in the fight. We have to step up and call out sin and call out discrimination and call out unjust where we see it. I'm reminded of Micah 6. What is God requiring of us? And it says, I require that you do justice and love kindness and walk humbly before God. That's a mandate that he's requiring of us as Christians and as believers. And we have to step up and say, God, what's my assignment? What am I supposed to do? My prayer is that as a faith community, black and white, we get a chance to come together and ask the question, help me understand. I'm hoping that my white brothers and sisters would say, help me understand. I want to learn. I want to glean. I want to grow. I want to hear your story. I want to partner with you. And what can I do to make a difference? And not stereotype and not say, oh, why are you bringing up the past? Because the past is a part of our history. And they want to erase the past, but you cannot erase the past. It's who we are. It's who God created us to be. So we have that history. And I need to share that with you. I need to talk with you about that. You need to ask me hard questions, but then you need to be okay when I give you the hard truth. And so that's the path that I think blacks have experienced in Black America, and how the church can come alongside and do better.
Can I ask another follow-up question and go off script a little bit? And this is open to everybody, but you said something really important that I've actually heard a lot, which is when you're talking about racism in the church and the history behind it, I've often heard, don't talk about that. That was in the past. Why are you bringing up the past? Don't bring politics into the church. How do you respond to that? I mean, any of you guys can answer that, but I just want to throw that out. How do you respond to that? What's your reaction to that?
Nobody likes to talk about the bad that goes on in their history. I've heard people say, well, that wasn't my generation. That was way back when, but it was still part of that history. And I need you to acknowledge that that did take place. Slavery and all those things that went along with it, discrimination, unconscious bias, all those things did happen. And all I'm asking is you to acknowledge that that did take place. And for you to ask me, how does that make you feel? My father picked cotton as a boy. Didn't have a choice, but he had to pick cotton. Ask me that story about that history. How did that make you feel? His father picked cotton. That was the only way we were able to survive. But that story is a part of the framework of who I am. And when you ask me about that, and I can tell you that story, it creates a bond and a relationship that you say, I didn't know that. I am sorry for what has happened to you and those that have gone before you. And I want you to know that I acknowledge that, And I want to create a relationship where we can continue to walk together and talk about those kinds of things and create a bond. I need partners that will say, Samuel, I hear you, I see you as a person, that you are fearfully and that you're wonderfully made. And that God has a plan and a purpose for your life, just like he has for my life. But when we partner together and understand each other's story and where we've come from and not dismiss it, that's where the healing will take place.
That's good. Did anyone else want to add to that a little bit, or want to leave the space? Yes, absolutely.
Because one thing I think of when I personally look at racism, and I hear that comment of, well, that happened in the past, and this specific event or tactic isn't taking place anymore, as I recognize that there may be two categories, and bear with me here, of racist situations that take place. There are active, overt, intentional things that individuals will do, but then there's this residual piece of it. There is this systematic that maybe not everything that happens is somebody saying, I'm going to choose to do this racist act. However, just the cultural setup, society, the way that things have been so ingrained. We talked about, you listed things like redlining, and what does that do for generational wealth and for the ability to purchase homes and things of that sort. And how did that, however many decades ago, not long, right? How does that impact where we are at in society now? And so while maybe, yes, someone isn't doing this specific action, that doesn't mean that the residual effects, the impacts of that, maybe how it's still laced, or we're trying to eradicate it and there's still just residue left, that still has an impact. And so there's still something to be able to address and acknowledge the experience that one is having in their experience, even if it isn't an active, intentional, act demonstrated toward them in that sense. And so I think that's super important. And then biblically, we just look at verses where it's like, bear one another's burdens, and to bear somebody's burden means that it may be uncomfortable, and I may not feel that or experience that or know that, and I don't understand how that in the past affected you now, but if it is still a burden of you, my brother, my sister, then I'm called to bear that with you in love. And so to be able to accept that mantle, like that is what a gift, right? What a gift and a privilege, but to accept that mantle of, I'm bearing this with you, even if I don't fully understand or see how it still has the impact that it does.
You don't have to understand it. You just have to love the person that's experiencing the pain from it. So that's great. Thank you so much for explaining that. My next question is for Samantha. Samantha, can you tell us about the education system here in Sacramento? And how can Sacramento improve and make education more inclusive and accessible?
Definitely. I think for me, growing up, and I think this experience that Ruth mentioned too, a lot of us grew up and, we had white teachers. I think I didn't get into my senior year until I got a black teacher, which is crazy to think about my senior year, growing up all those years. But I think now working in education and kind of seeing the behind the scenes of students and the suspension rate in high school and middle school and the problems that we need to fix. And I think even right now I'm at Sac State. Sac State is a huge campus, about 30,000 students, and Black or African identifying students only make up about 1,800 students, which is not a lot at all. And kind of seeing how students, once we transition from high school to college, that accessibility, like are students, getting a chance to go to Sac State? Are they getting a chance to go to a 4-year? Is it because of, lack of funds? Is it because of grades? Is it because of what? And so I think, even looking at one thing that really struck me in Sacramento County is that we are the highest of suspension rates for middle school boys in middle school and in high school. And it's like, why is that the case? Why are these students getting suspended? Is because, we're not dealing with the issues at hand. We're just, you need to go to the principal's office. You need to go see the dean or whatever. It's not like we're addressing, okay, is this happening because something's happening at home? Is it because of grades? Is it because of friends? And I think, hiring more, teachers and faculty of color, and addressing those issues instead of saying, okay, you're in trouble, you're pushing to the side, and adding to that problem. And I just think that hiring more faculty and more teachers of color, I think it's not going to solve everything, but I think it'll add and it'll help, because students can see, okay, I have somebody who can relate to me, somebody who can look like, who looks like me, and who can help me succeed. And so, yes, that's a start, and it's not going to fix, the whole problem, but I definitely think that's where we should start.
Do you think, you didn't know I was going to ask you this, I'm just thinking about it now, but having heard what Ruth was saying and what Trey was saying, do you think that students, Black students, when they see that they aren't represented in faculty and places of authority, when they see that their teachers and their principals are white, does that create a level of distrust and trepidation in terms of, if I'm a Black student and I'm struggling with something, am I going to feel less safe or like I can trust those teachers in authority?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, for me, I think growing up, just even the way that they treated me, I think kind of overlooking if I had questions, or, even if I'm raising my hand in class and just kind of picking the person next to me, it builds that level of, I'm not going to trust you if you're not even going to help me, if you're not even going to recognize me as a student, or if I come to you for help, or if I'm like, hey, I'm struggling, and you're just like, oh, it's okay, it's whatever, you'll get it, read the next chapter. It's like, I'm not going to want to trust you. It's like when you're not putting effort into my education, or even like the way that I learn. If I'm like, hey, I'm a visual learner, can you maybe make this, a visual presentation? And they're like, nope, it's gonna be a reading and writing assignment, and I'm over here stuck like, okay, that's not gonna work for me. And I think then it's like, okay, I'm shutting down, I don't even care, I'm disengaged, I don't want to be a part of this. And then that's when we see bad grades, we see acting out, we see suspension rates. And so, having that level of trust with your teacher, with whoever, higher up, I think is important, instead of just kind of grazing over like, oh, it's okay, you'll get it. So,
Because that's the easy thing, is
that's
for a
the
teacher
easy
to
thing
just say,
do. Yeah.
I don't want to deal with this problem. I don't want to see it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to send you to the principal's office.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings me to the question that I'm about to ask you, Trey, which is where is racism not seen in Sacramento? Where is it unseen? Where is racism unseen or overlooked in Sacramento? And what are some of the biggest changes you'd like to see in Sacramento specifically?
Yeah, even as you ask that question live, after I've marinated on it for a couple of weeks, I still, ponder my response. And I'm very grateful for all of the answers that we've already heard that have probably addressed this question in such a strong way. I'm going to try to be concise here as I go through my thought process here. The first thing I want to say is, I love that this panel is called The Black Experience. But I also want to pause and make sure that I identify the fact that this, as I speak, is a Black experience, right? I have an individual Black experience that may be a little bit different, and I really put that in context of this question because I've been here in Sacramento for about 7 months, right? So I don't have the full understanding of and it's been during a pandemic. I mean, hey, at least we're like getting to go to restaurants again, but I don't have the full understanding of what's going on in the academic school system. I'm a single man on my own, so I don't have a family. I don't have kids. I haven't gone to a doctor here yet, so I haven't really experienced the culture and seen all that's going on. And this question made me realize, and even having lived in kind of the suburbs in Southern California where I lived, and then moving to Redding, California, and then living in kind of Morgan Hill, suburbs of San Jose, Sacramento is one of the most diverse places that I've lived, and I've been more exposed to Black culture being up here, and I made the mistake of making synonymous the presence of diversity and equalizing and putting that equal with the absence of racism. And I can slip into that very easily. And so I'm even learning as I'm sitting here what's going on in society. So, hey, I'm with all of you all learning. And so, but then it really it got me thinking about, so then what have I seen and have I experienced? And we've heard some stats and we've heard some stories. And And what I love about these stories, because I have a couple of stories that I'll say real quick, that made me realize, oh, this racism is definitely active, and if I could just pay attention and open my eyes and listen a little bit, I'll see it. And the first time I went to there was a little powwow festival in South Sacramento, and as I was driving and going past neighborhoods, and this restaurant is overflowing and it's popular, and then this place there's so many people piled up and it's active, and then you just see a impoverished neighborhood. And there's a few pockets like that, and I start to pay attention to who are the residents in these neighborhoods, and it's primarily black people. And I go, there's something wrong here. I don't know the full narrative. I don't know all the dynamics of when XYZ was built and what, if gentrification, I don't know all of that, but I can see that there's a clear distinction here that takes place that leads me to believe there's some racism, there's some active things going on that's perpetuating this issue. And then the other way that I truly recognized, maybe I have, and I pray that I never do experience it to this magnitude, but maybe I haven't experienced this level of racism, but I was sitting down at some family's house, and a young man, after a fun day of just kind of hanging out, he opens up, he gets really emotional and is talking about life. And young black man, early 20s, and he just gets up and he starts crying. And he just goes, why do they hate me? Like, why do they hate me? I'm just trying to make a living like them and I don't get a chance. Why do I have to, when I'm walking to work, be worried and concerned and be pulled over and be, stopped for no reason at all when I'm just trying to live the fullness of life that everybody's trying to pursue? Like, why do I have to experience that? And I think when I hear that story, when I get in a circle and hug a young black man, a young black boy who's just trying to figure out, how do I just live in a city that feels like it hates me for no reason? I think those are the unseen moments where you go, okay, this racism is still very much so alive. And I don't know if I have all the answers on how to solve it per se, but it made it evident to me that there are things that are going on, and while I'm blessed and fortunate to maybe not have experienced some of that, and many of us in the audience and online are in that same boat, it doesn't negate the fact that it happens. And so then kind of to that second question of, so what would I like to see done to help eradicate that? I think there's almost, when I think of, and again, personally, when I think of addressing racism, I often think of two perspectives, and one is policy of some dynamic, and the other is, heart change. You have like policy change and you have heart change. And policy change is so necessary because it's like, look, if you're gonna hate me, at least let me have a nice house. Like, look, I just want a meal, okay? But at the end of the day, also having a nice house is great, but if I just know that you still hate me and are not for me, that's still very racist in itself too. And so how do you hear the stories? How do you tell the stories? How do you have those conversations? How do you provide the same level of attention and excitement and advocating for Black events? How do you create and share the culture in such a way where it's not just, okay, cool, they let us in too, but oh no, I'm being celebrated in this, and you're learning and you're sharing and we're connecting, and there's actual intimacy and relationship and vulnerability, because that's where that heart change starts to happen. And so I think both are so important, and I think it can be easier at times to get behind policy. Hey, let me join you for this, this protest or this movement, or sign a piece of paper, which is necessary, but then go on about our business and never even have any relationship capital to know if that's having an impact. And it's when you have that heart change that goes, man, I want to actually love an individual, that helps me to then shift the way I look at people, and then also create that change of culture within my group, which then can expand out. So that how do we create those experiences where heart change can happen by introducing the beauty of Black culture to more people? I hope that answers your question.
I feel like that did answer that question and many other questions that I have. So thank you. And you said something really important that I kind of wanted to touch on. You said when you came to Sacramento, you noticed that it was diverse, and you didn't want to, you caught yourself and said, let me not equate diversity with equality. And I think that that is something worth sitting in for a moment. I mean, I don't even know what question to ask to extrapolate on that, but I mean, I think we see it in the workforce where you say, "Oh no, but we have a Black teacher. No, we have a Black accountant." Like, that's like we, you know, and we laugh and we chuckle, but it's the tokenism of we have Pastor Samuel. He's a Black pastor, and then that in turn, someone who is white like me could say, "Oh, I'm not racist. My pastor is Black." And we hear that and we think, well, that's ridiculous, but that's a reality. Some people actually say that. And I think that idea of tokenism is something that is rampant, and we see it in a lot of corporations. I don't know if any of you guys want to speak on that, maybe in the school system or the work world, if you guys want to add to that at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing I always have to remind people is, Black people, we're not a monolith. We are not all the same. We may have the same skin tone, but we are not the same. And I think that tokenism part that you were talking about, it's evident. And I think it kind of gives people a pass of like you said, oh, well, my pastor's Black, my friend's Black, the faculty and staff here, they're Black, so that makes me cool, that makes me in. But it's like, no, you're not doing the work. And I think one thing, it's not our job to teach you. It's not my job to say, hey, go pick up a book, go, watch a movie, listen to a podcast. That's not my job. It's your job to go and to research, to ask questions, to learn, to listen, and to just take a step back and stop talking and listen. I think the more that you think, well, I have coworkers and I have friends and I have people that I know who are Black. Okay, cool, that's great. But are you doing the work? Are you listening? Are you really just holding space to think differently, to think outside of yourself? I think sometimes all of us, we get caught up in how our opinion and how we see things, but it's like, no, how do I see it from a different point of view? How can I step back and say, hey, I'm sorry that made you feel this way. I'm sorry that you're experiencing this right now, or that this, situation happened. And I don't want to fix it, but how can I just listen and make sure that I'm there for you? Sometimes it's not about fixing things or finding a solution to things. It's about listening and just being there. And so I think that's one way.
That's so good. One of the things that I recently was learning about, thanks to Stacy and some other of my friends in the medical field, was the racism and the racist tendencies and ideologies in the medical field that I hadn't even known about until having these conversations and hearing it, and it's gut-wrenching. And that's the question that I wanted to ask you, Stacy, was can you elaborate a little bit on what is racism in the healthcare system? Some people here might be thinking, what does that mean? Can you talk about how racism is present in the healthcare system?
I have fellow physicians asking that question. How could there be racism in healthcare? When you go through training in medicine, it's really a focus on the science, diseases, making a diagnosis, figuring out what's wrong. And physicians or healthcare providers kind of detach themselves from the fact that they're human. And the reality is the neuroscience is telling us that our brains are wired for prejudgment, which is prejudice. Our brains are wired for stereotyping. And our brains are wired for bias. And so many people on the panel have said already that to let go of racism is a daily, intentional, informed way to live. My colleagues, this is a generalization, in 2000, the New England Journal put out a study that basically showed that a group of physicians had discriminated in their diagnoses. And the discrimination was biggest between white male patients and black female patients. And at that time, as a community of healthcare providers, people were, that's impossible. We're fair, we're fair-minded, we're altruistic. But what we didn't realize, well, what wasn't realized was just because we were MDs didn't mean we weren't human. So the same way anybody's brain is predisposed towards prejudice, we were predisposed towards prejudice. So and 20 years later, 30 years later, many years later, the hundreds and thousands of studies that demonstrate the level of discrimination and disparity in healthcare is really alarming. I think for me, I'm a pediatrician, and PDs are incredibly loving doctors because we're working with kids. So when we hear about discrimination in our field, it's just gut-wrenching. There was a study that came out maybe 18 months ago, maybe 2 years now, out of the state of Florida that showed black babies were 3 times more likely to die if their physician were white. So I'm going to repeat that. Black babies were 3 times more likely to die if their physicians were white. And I sat with a fellow white pediatrician, and we cried together, talking about that study. So I bring that up just to say that there are so many well-intentioned humans on the planet who are not going through their day-to-day lives, waking up and saying to themselves, I'm going to go out and be racist today. But as you were talking about, this is more than just heart change, it's also systemic change. And that means that we have to be incredibly intentional. There's so much that I could say. I'm going to just share one quick story.
You take all the time you need.
One
Stacy
quick
knows everything. So a lot of people don't know that she does know everything. So take as much time as you need, Stacy.
I have a personal story I want to share, and that is, and this came up thinking about education and the black community, and we're not a monolith. And when I was in 9th grade, well, I'm just going to say it, I loved school.
You're a doctor, we know.
I loved everything about school, and so, yes, I was the model student. And in 9th grade, my 9th grade white biology teacher went around the room and asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I had been decorated citywide as a 9th grade science student. And as we went around the room, I said, well, I want to be a doctor. And he proceeded to discourage me. So I'm one of the top students in the class, one of the top students around the city, but my teacher was discouraging me. But I was really, really lucky because I ran home and said, can you believe so-and-so said I should be a lab technician? And the next day, both my parents were in the principal's office. And I say this to really talk about what you were saying, is young people, young black people, young brown, need those voices, those narratives to remind them that they are somebody, that they are capable, that they are loved, so that they can fulfill their dreams. I'm in the business of racial healing. And so I get people of different races together to sit down to have brave conversations about race. And I'm mentioning it because what I notice in this space is people come into the space anxious, fearful, questioning, and they leave the space connected, in love, right? And hopeful. And I think one of the biggest issues is that we're separated. And I'm not talking about, I don't need to be your best friend, but I can be a really good friend. I feel like I'm rambling now.
You're not. You are giving us everything that we want to hear, all of the information. But you said something really fascinating that kind of leads into the final question here. We're talking about racial reconciliation. You said we're separated. And there's that statistic that is 9 a.m. on a Sunday is the most segregated hour in America, because even churches are the most segregated institution in America to this day. But I think it's in a lot of corporations and a lot of just the way we exist. I mean, even you were saying, Trey, that the neighborhoods are separated. I mean, how many people in this room or watching can say that your neighbor is black, that the apartment next to you is black? I mean, the separation in home life and work life and third space life is separated. And how do we reach racial reconciliation if we're not willing to do life together and participate and have our circles of influence come together and not remain separate? And I know, Pastor Samuel, you had mentioned when we were backstage talking about what racial reconciliation is and how it's different than forgiveness. If you want to kick us off, what does racial reconciliation mean and how do we step into it?
That is something that is every day we need to work on. Just listening to the panel, when we talk about reconciliation, sometimes we get that confused with forgiveness. And with forgiveness, it only takes one person to forgive. I can forgive you without you forgiving me, but I can forgive you. But reconciliation requires two people willing to walk together, to have hard conversations, to engage one another, to speak truth to one another. I'm a strong proponent of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think every public school should have a department of equity, diversity and inclusion. I think every church should have that same department, making sure that everybody has a seat at the table. Going through college and teachers learning how to be teachers, they didn't teach, there was no subject on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they're just kind of trying to figure it out how to deal with black and brown kids who learn differently. They have different challenges. Some don't take tests well. So if you don't understand those nuances, you just want to put them all in the same basket and say, work it out. But understanding each individual child, their uniqueness, that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, that God has a plan and a purpose and a path for each one of those lives, you have a responsibility to meet them where they are and where they live. So that diversity, equity, and inclusion is huge. If we're going to reconcile, if we're going to walk together. We're supposed to be bridge builders. We're supposed to be, especially people of faith, we're to line up on this side of the cross. We're to do no harm. We're to love those who are disenfranchised, the homeless, those who have mental health issues, those who have behavioral issues. Our job is to come alongside and say, help me understand. If we don't do that, we sometimes think the cross is about Jesus dying on the cross to help us get to God. But the cross should be a sledgehammer to break down division and separation. That's what the cross is there for, to break down those things that hinder us from becoming one. Jesus said, I want you to be one as me and the Father are one. When you see me, you've seen the Father. I want you to look at me and celebrate our differences, that we are different, but we are the same. I want you to look at me, and when I hurt, you say, I I can't walk in your shoes, but I want to walk with you. When we do that, that's where reconciliation takes place, and it's laying down one plank at a time and then stepping on that plank. You lay down a plank and you step on that plank. At some point, that bridge is going to come together and we're going to have a conversation. We're going to meet for coffee. We're going to talk about what do we have in common that's going to impact our community, that's going to impact the homeless population that we have, the disparity in wages. What can we do as a church? And I think our voice needs to be heard. And we need to have town hall meetings. We need to have symposiums where we come together and bring in the experts and talk about what ails the community. I believe that every church and every pastor should be known and loved in the community that they serve. That doesn't mean that that community has walked through the doors of the church. It means that the church has engaged the community and have gone into the community and say, how can we help? How can we help? How can we lighten the load for you? That's God's arms extended into our community, and that's where we need to go. I believe that post-COVID, it's not about buildings anymore. It's not about coming into this place, but ministry is in the community. Ministry is taking the gospel from here and embracing our community. We need to do that 24/7, 7 days a week, engaging the community, engaging the young people, setting up after-school programs for them, using our church building for after-school programs, going into the community, knocking on doors, how can we help? Taking food and taking resources into the community, how can we help? That's what church needs to look like post-COVID. That's what God is calling the church to say, it's time to step up. And I believe God is saying to our church community, whatever you're going to give me, give it to me now. I need what you have now because people are hurting and people need someone to love on them and to care for them. And as ambassadors of the kingdom and the cross, that's what God has called all of us to do.
Amen. Does anyone else want to add to that about what racial reconciliation means?
If I might.
Specifically? Yes.
Did you hear my voice out of nowhere come? Yeah, this morning I was thinking about this question and spent a little bit of time in prayer. And there was a pastor who once said, if you strip a man or a human, a person of their God-given dignity, they will begin to act undignified. And so when I think of racial reconciliation, I think of it as restoring people's God-given dignity that has been stripped away or attempted to be stripped away based off of their race, ethnicity, their culture. How do we restore that God-given dignity back to our brother, our sister, more importantly than your relationship to me, God's daughter, God's son? Yes. And I think for me, I can get discouraged at times because it can feel like a drop in a huge ocean. It can feel like it has no real ripple. And what I've started to even realize, like for me to stay encouraged in that racial reconciliation process is recognizing that my job, I may not myself change and eradicate and eliminate racism altogether, right? But in my attempts to have a heart of reconciliation, I can impact the one. You know, we know that Jesus uses the parable. He leaves the 99 to go after the one. And so as a Christian, my heart should be focused on the one and then the next one and the next one and the next one at times. And so whether that one is restoring the dignity onto an individual that allows them to live life fully and more abundantly, or whether the one is being able to enlighten someone to change and to recognize their sinful ways that we all possess, for them to have a heart change and come to know Christ, which in turn will also allow them to live life more fully and abundantly. And so that's the beauty of reconciliation, is that it has a beautiful impact for everyone the oppressor and the oppressed, especially when we're kingdom focused about restoring the God-given dignity back to humanity. And so that's kind of what, the Lord blessed me with this morning when I was just like, man, I'm so glad I got invited to this panel because I'm learning.
I know exactly what I'm going to say.
If I could just add to that was so good. But you have to ask yourself, what are the next steps? How do we manifest this? What needs
what are
to
the
happen?
tangibles?
Yeah. So for me, that reconciliation means my brothers and sisters willing to hear my story. My white brothers and sisters willing to hear my story. How do you do that? Over a cup of coffee, over a dinner, break some bread together. Hearing my story is going to give you a frame of reference of who I am, where I've come from, and just hearing my story, that's a point of connection. And then the other part of it is welcome a different ethnicity into your circles. How many of us have friends outside of our own culture? Be intentional of welcoming someone that doesn't look like you, sound like you, eat the kind of same food that you do into your sphere of influence and circles so that you get to hear their stories, they get to hear your stories. And then I would encourage all of us to serve cross-culturally. It's when we go into a neighborhood and clean a widows or single moms and cut our grass and do some repairs. When we do that together, serving cross-culturally, that brings about relationship. It's bridge building. So we got to have some things that we can tangibly touch and do to bring about reconciliation. It's not about talking about it. It's about action. It's about doing something. It's about stepping out of your comfort zone. It's about saying, help me understand. And when we do that, if your heart is the heart of God, you're going to say, I'm all in. And I'm willing to stand up for you. I need my white brothers and sisters to look at me and say, Brother Sam, I got your back. I got you. Because I'm going to have your back. Why? Because Christ had all of our backs. He paid that ultimate price that we can be free, and whom he has set free, we are truly free indeed. So that's that assignment, and that's that calling, and that's those next steps.
Give it up for our panelists this evening, everybody. Thank you, everyone on the panel for coming and for engaging in this challenging but very critical conversation. I'm so appreciative. I know everyone watching and that is here in person is very appreciative for everything you've brought to the table. Obviously, we cannot begin to scratch the surface on this topic in an hour-long panel. So we at Please Elaborate, we're going to be continuing this conversation by looking at racism in the Bible and in the Christian church over the next few weeks. I know it's going to be a very intense conversation over the next month or two, but we're going to be diving into this and looking more critically at this and going deep and looking at systemic racism. So if that's something that you're watching and you want to be a part of, you can follow us. We're on Instagram at Please Elaborate. If you want to join this conversation in a more extensive way, we're going to be having a racial reconciliation workshop in the spring of next year, and all of that information will be over on our Instagram and on our mailing list. But as for now, we can leave it at that. I'm so grateful for everyone here. Thank you, everyone that's watching online, for everyone that came out tonight. Thank you, and we will see you at our next panel. Bye, everybody.